just to give a brief background on how we got here. So in Ohio, as many folks may know, Ohio is experiencing some incredibly restrictive policy introductions and even passing some of those policies. That's being reflected at all of the socio-ecological model layers, right? Because we know that policy and our societal kind of attitudes are reflected in our communities. They're reflected in our relationships, and even at individual levels, they help shape our values and beliefs. And so we are seeing a fairly large shift happening at our community level. Lots of pushback, parental rights. And I often, I'm in conversation with folks who say, whose parental rights, right? Like, who gets to have those rights? And so we're struggling. We're seeing a lot of that reflected in kind of the push and pull at the political level, but really from a prevention standpoint, we've heard quite a bit, at least I have, in our technical assistance settings from our local programs, just saying that they're struggling. We are seeing the highest rates of turnover that we've ever experienced in the prevention field. I see a lot of head nods. So this isn't unique to Ohio. I think a lot of that has to do with a lot of different layers of our field in general, but we're seeing it in our COVID years of kind of the fissures that happened when we had to pause programming and having to redevelop some of those community partnerships. But we're also seeing that in tandem with the multi-pronged attack on human rights. And so there's a lot of surveillance happening within classrooms. There's a lot of surveillance happening within communities. And there's a lot of kind of individualized approaches to our community's well-being. And we know that that is not going to work from a prevention standpoint if we can't find a way to move forward in some shared values. And we know that there are shared values of not wanting violence to happen in our communities, but how we get there is where those fissures start to show up even more so. So with that, there was kind of this, like, we need something now. We can have all the conversations in the world, but we need something that's going to support folks in the field right now. And so before we dive into the presentation, I just want to mention that there are supplemental resources that have been shared in, I think it's in our bio presentation, that world. I haven't seen it. But what you'll find there is this was kind of the initial approach, was not this presentation, not a web conference. It was, what are some practical supports? And so first, alongside Monica Garcia Vega, we created, and with the help of the Wisconsin Coalition, so Monica is part of the Florida Coalition, and with input from the Wisconsin Coalition, we created the school-based prevention roadmap. So this alongside, and then I kind of said, like, okay, we can have a roadmap, but like, how do we actually put it into action, right? So you'll see this. We won't go all the way through because actually it's going to come up quite a bit in the presentation today, but just as a note, you'll have this. Please use it widely, share it, do whatever you would like with it. But it's a really just kind of like breaks down through the lens of critical race theory, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And then also like how other facets of our work are being attacked, including social emotional learning. And so with that, you'll also get, it's essentially kind of like a quicker breakdown of some of the features of the roadmap, some kind of like an infographic of sorts, talking about some practical ways that we can implement. But really today, we're gonna be talking more about what are the solutions y'all are coming up with. So these are just some, but there's plenty more out there. And then finally, there's the sustainability toolbox. This is a worksheet that I really encourage folks to take back to their organizations and work together on, because if we're not really leaning into the things that we're already doing, we're just gonna keep reinventing the wheel, and like we don't actually need to do all of that. Oh, hi, Monica. My wonderful collaborator back there. So just really encouraging folks to look through those resources, and we will dive in to the workshop from there. All right. So first and foremost, little mind-body check-in. So I really like to do this at the beginning of presentations because we're coming here with like all sorts of expectations, like feelings. People are maybe like a little bit fatigued from flying. I mean, some people are coming from across the country. So what I am encouraging everybody to do, it looks like a lot of folks already have writing utensils and paper out. You don't need this if you don't want. You can kind of just think about it, is think about one or two kind of emotions or kind of anticipatory kind of like expectations you have, and either write that down somewhere on your paper or just kind of internalize that for yourself. So I'll give you a second to do that. So what feelings are you coming into this workshop with? What are you hoping to get out of this workshop? Okay, as you're finishing that up, feel free to keep writing. I'm not gonna ask anybody to share out, but in a perfect world, we would actually be doing this workshop in a much smaller space. So I would actually ask you to ball that up and throw it to the front. But for today's purposes, we'll just imagine that's happening. And that's really to symbolize that we're all coming in with kind of our own stuff, right? But that we can hold ourselves and each other in that. Because again, if we're not coming from a community standpoint, if we're not thinking about each other and the folks around us as we're doing this work, then we're really not going to move very far forward. So just keeping in mind those pieces as we head into our group agreements and then throughout the workshop today. So I hope you revisit that. Our objectives for today, so we're going to define the elements of the disaster management cycle and their relevance to primary prevention education. We will dive into that more. Folks, I see some quizzical looks, so we'll talk a little more about that. Identifying 1 to 3 strategies currently being used to address school-based prevention education barriers. We'll not only talk about what's happening in Ohio, but I'll ask folks to share out some strategies that have been working for you as well. And then develop a plan to implement at least one proactive strategy for individual professionals and organizations. So quickly, group agreements, because why not preventionists? First and foremost, how many people in the space are working in prevention in some capacity? Okay, great. Didn't want to make an assumption, but that was kind of the assumption. Okay, so our group agreements, including make space, take space. So if you're somebody who typically enjoys sharing out and processes quickly, just take a tick, take a moment to pause. For the folks who I encourage to take space, if you process at a different rate or don't like to share out as much, I encourage your voice to be shared in the space as much as that feels comfortable. Jen will have a mic in the back. We'll want to make sure that we're using that for recording purposes. Intent versus impact. Again, we may say things that might land a little bit out of pocket for some folks, and we want to like honor that in the space. One of the ways that we can do that is just a quick ouch, oops moment. You can yell that out, ouch, if that is something that didn't feel good for you, and we'll kind of acknowledge that and work through that. You can also come to me afterwards and we can talk through that, especially if it's something that I've said that's landed not great for you, okay? So not just saying that intent versus impact, but like what does it look like in action, right? And then seeking to understand, again, asking questions before we jump in to offer support. I think that's one of the things that we sometimes miss in our training, in our education. So let's really seek to understand what other folks are saying before we jump in with that. And then finally, accepting incompletion. We're not changing things today in an hour-and-a-half workshop. So take that back with you to your organization. I am due to diminished capacity to breathe. Going to take this off. Thank you for the masking, y'all. And I'll be staying back here, so Jen will be around. Are there anything else that we want to add to this list before we hop in? All right, defining the problem. So As we kind of move into this is just going to be a brief introduction. Some folks have maybe heard an iteration of this from the RPE dialogues from last year, but I kind of want to just set us up in this space. So how many people in this space are from states that have either introduced or passed restrictive education policies or ones that impact? Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And so this is really telling us right now a story, right? Is that we have folks from all across the country that are experiencing those things in their states. And if you haven't yet, it doesn't mean that you won't. And so this is how we plan for primary prevention, right? We want to stop it before it starts. So how are we learning from everybody in this space? So I also want to acknowledge that attacks on education are not new. And this is actually reflective of what Nicole Pittman was saying this morning in the plenary, was about us not being in tune with our history in the US. And one of those pieces is about education attacks. And this is a historical kind of pastime of Americans, especially folks in the dominant culture. And so I'll give you a couple of examples of how that's come to light over the years, so that we aren't necessarily staying in the doom and gloom, but it really does actually prepare us. That's part of the work we do, is the research to prepare us to take action. So this has been happening for decades. We saw this back in the 1920s. There was legislation pushing to ensure that religion was at the center of education. We saw this in the 1930s through the 1950s, when teachers were being surveilled to make sure they weren't indoctrinating students into communism. We're seeing quite a bit of that rhetoric coming back in right now, right? So this is cycles. It's not that history repeats itself, it's that we as a society repeat those things. We also saw this in the 1960s, and I'll quickly quote a Slate article that was quoted, or that was titled, "How Picking on Teachers Became an American Tradition." Said California Superintendent of Public Instruction Max Rafferty called teachers quote unquote bums who were focusing too much on America's faults instead of the quote, the magnificent world-changing deeds of our national heroes. And in the 1980s, right-wing pundit Sam Blumenfeld earned the approval of the Reagan Department of Education by calling teachers a dangerous Trojan horse in American education. How many people are seeing parallels in this language? Right? Yeah, so again, this is a playbook, not an unprecedented moment. And I know that that may not feel good for everyone, but for me, it's information that helps us prepare, because there's people who've already faced this before us. And so this brief history doesn't cover the breadth of attacks that have taken place throughout US history, right? We know that this has been happening even before organized education. We saw it in Indian residential schools, right? These were attacks to assimilate into dominant culture by way of violence, and is still happening today. So we've seen this in so many different facets. So we can look at history to tell us what our present and potential future holds, and how we might combat these impending disasters with the skills we have already honed. So talking a little bit more about disasters. So just briefly, I know you all know that also another part of the problem is that our field itself disproportionately leaves prevention behind. The funding is not there, so that becomes an uphill battle for us to gain grounding and also build capacity. So it really is antithetical to the work we're doing for our funders and for our organizations not to prioritize primary prevention. It's also of note that when we look at these intersecting pieces, that we're keeping in mind that we're not abandoning the very foundations of the work that is required in order for us to do primary prevention, which is anti-oppression frameworks. We cannot leave that behind in order to reach folks in our communities who are requiring us to say, like, no, you can't talk about that part of the curriculum, or you're not invited here. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what are some strategies that we can navigate that in order for us to uphold the values and the actual work, because we can't do primary prevention work without it. And one of the things that I want to highlight as what was a driving force initially for this was the critical race theory as part of an anti-oppressive approach. And so it's important to note that we're not teaching critical race theory in schools, and that's something that we have been fighting in school board meetings and with parents about. But what we do have to recognize is that our field is also doing a disservice by distancing ourselves from critical race theory, because the very policies that critical race theory has actually been able to enact support the education we're able to do in our schools. And so it's important for us to make those delineations, right? That we're not teaching. It's not an indoctrination into leftist ideologies, which is often the language we're hearing, but it's also that we're not discounting the impacts of critical race theory and the positive impacts that it's having. And that without it, we have book bans, right? We have curricula that teaches that slavery was actually good, right? Like, so it's important for us to keep that in mind as a group. And then also the intersections of primary prevention and social emotional learning. We as a field have lots of jargon, lots of acronyms, right? And what we're hearing, at least in Ohio, and I've heard kind of reflected in some of our town hall spaces, has been the everyday person doesn't know all of the jargon. And so when they hear CRT and SEL, like, what happens? Automatically kind of gets put together, right? And people automatically are going to have that knee-jerk reaction to say, well, we don't want that in our schools, right? But we can't do this work without building empathy and equity in order to prevent violence from happening. So how do we ensure that we're building foundations that we can meet these moments with confidence, strength, and understanding in their interconnectedness? This is where you all come into play. And this is where we come into play as a collective. We're gonna do a bit of a barriers activity to start us off, just so we can better understand what we're working with. I know we've done this in various capacities in different spaces. If you were at the RPE dialogue yesterday, that is something that we we dived into a bit. But we are going to talk about specific barriers that you may be facing in schools, or that if you are working from a technical assistance and training perspective, what you're hearing from local programs as well. So with that, this is going to be a few minutes and we'll brainstorm together. So who's going to be the lucky one to start us off? What are some barriers that y'all are facing in your state?
I have a microphone, so please wait till you get that. Thanks.
Even talking about contraception at all as if it exists.
I think the language that we're using, rape prevention education, RPE, is creating a pretty major barrier for some of us.
I would say, I don't know if I can speak for the state, but Baltimore City, as far as meeting basic needs first in order to kind of address these larger concepts in schools.
And I'll come to the other side. Don't worry, y'all. Can you pass this down, please? Thank you.
Abstinence-only curriculums in schools.
Thanks. Oh, okay. Got a couple more on this side. And then I'm going to head over to the other side. I promise.
Parents opting their children out of the classes.
Just like a general resistance to accepting that maybe we should do the work in different ways.
similarly to how we have experienced a lot of staffing turnover within the sexual education prevention community, we're seeing a lot of turnover within our collaborators at the school level. So there's a high turnover in school leadership, and then you're losing that historical work that you've done with the school, so you're starting from zero.
Culturally competent curriculums that address the needs for parents or caregivers to be engaged.
The assumption that consent education is always sexualized and, attempting to sexualize children. Barriers to evaluate the program, such as conducting surveys.
If we talk about it, they're going to do it. It will happen.
Can we do one more? Okay, thank you.
LGBTQ inclusivity.
Okay. This is such a great list. It's a really diverse list, right? So we all have things that we can pull from this, I would imagine. And if you don't see anything that's reflected, feel free to write that down to remind yourself of those things that you're seeing in your state, because we'll return to this later on in the workshop. But these are really important things to keep in mind, especially when we're thinking about the socio-ecological model, right? About individual, relational, or community dynamics that are impacting the things that we're seeing in our school systems, because our schools aren't just an extension of our community, it's a community in its own right that's housed within a larger community. So how are we looking at those dynamics as kind of layered barriers in a sense? So it's important for us to keep these things in mind, because not only are we seeing this happening kind of like from an influence at a state legislation level, we're seeing the ripple effects, right? So we see that many states have introduced or plan to policies that would restrict us from doing the work that we do under the guise of it being divisive. That includes critical race theory and spreading misinformation about what is taught in the classroom, which does seem to be pretty reflected in many of the barriers we're seeing here. Now, that ripple effect then can be seen in the local programs, because we're seeing programming like healthy relationships, empathy building, and power and privilege being surveilled and excluded from classroom education. Social emotional learning, right, is part of that empathy building, or it's the framework for the empathy building. And so when you have people already questioning what that means, we can't even get a foot in the door, or we're gonna have to eliminate those things from a curriculum in order to stay in the classroom, which is just, I would say, non-negotiable, because we can't prevent violence if we're not actually creating connection. And then also we're seeing the increase in violence, right? Because when learners don't have access to lessons on empathy, conflict resolution, privilege and oppression, and healthy relationship skill building, as well as others, we know that violence increases. This is also creating a fissure in protective factors, including caring adults, right? Or a supportive learning environment. Because if a teacher is in there saying that we can't hear those things or surveilling education, they no longer are a trusted adult for that young person to come to. Because when we leave the classroom, we can't dictate how that environment is going to go. And so we really have to pay attention to just how many barriers really start to ramp up if we can't teach those things in the classroom, and also not just to our learners, because our learners aren't just the students, they're also the teacher, the staff, the faculty. Wherever you are, these lessons need to penetrate throughout our entire environment, right? That ripple effect is important. So, with all of that, it's time to identify some strategies, right? Because we can get stuck in the loop of like, this is never going to change, this is too much. But in fact, throughout history, not only were those policies, those restrictive policies put in place, but they were overturned, right? We see that there's pushback and that it's not just about creating a critical mass, it's about finding folks who are willing to be in it for the long haul. So, identifying some strategies. So this requires us to move beyond responses, right? Because if we constantly just wait for the next policy to happen, we're not actually doing primary prevention work, we're doing intervention work. That is always kind of a little bit of a tough place in our prevention world in general of like bystander intervention work, right? In the very name itself, it's intervention, not necessarily prevention, though we are working on interrupting, right? But we can actually move to a more proactive space at these more macro levels, as well as how are we reflecting on our own kind of organizational values and beliefs, as well as support in order to do this work in a more proactive way. So with that, we're back to disaster. I promise to go somewhere. So if you have your phone, this is a time where you are encouraged to use it for sure. So scanning that QR code, if that is not possible, I will definitely get you the code to access Mentimeter. It's a polling platform, and what we're going to do is respond to this. What words come to mind when you hear the word disaster? Try to use one word. If you want to use multiple, do not put spaces between them or it won't populate as a phrase. So let's take a moment for this, and I'm gonna move over to the Mentimeter so folks can get the code if you can't scan that QR code. So, okay, so you can also join by going to menti.com and using the code at the top of the screen here. For anyone who has not used this platform before or not used a word cloud before, the more a word is entered, the bigger it becomes. So that means we're seeing a lot of responses saying emergency, trauma, chaos, crisis, tragedy, fear. See hurricane, incredibly important for us to know that that is a crisis right now, right? A disaster right now in many capacities. Yeah, this is awesome. So keep adding to it, but this gives us a really important kind of framework because we're seeing catastrophe, homeless, natural disaster, survivor guilt. That's a really important one. Lack of understanding, unprepared, community, disruption, unpreventable. And the reason why we talk about disaster is because we have to prepare for barriers, even if we can't necessarily prevent them altogether. We can proactively strategize, much like a disaster management team does, in order to mitigate the most kind of, the biggest impacts or the most dangerous or long-lasting impacts of a crisis or a disaster. And so what we're seeing here is reflected in what we are going to talk about regarding disaster and disaster management. Y'all named so many important pieces of like, disaster is unpreventable. But what if it wasn't always unpreventable, right? What if we did have the power and the privilege and the positions that we're in at our organizations with the capacity to engage not only in our organizations, but also at community levels, talking with our community members about what are the disasters we're seeing right now? Because a disaster, by definition, is a catastrophe that interacts with humans. We may not always see it as such, and it may not always be that definition for us individually, but generally speaking, a disaster is a catastrophe that is interacting with humans. What we see here is the disaster management framework that disaster management teams use in order to prevent and respond to disasters. And so we actually see a lot reflected in the work we do in actually the disaster management framework. I don't know how I got here. I think it was like a podcast. And I was like, wait, this makes so much sense. Because we think about not only primary prevention, but also secondary and tertiary prevention, right? Much like disaster management teams think about disasters. So they think about mitigation and risk reduction as essentially their primary prevention, right? They think about their preparedness, which also can be primary prevention, but it also can push out into secondary and tertiary, because we do have to be prepared for the fact that in the space that we hold now as a society, the vast majority of folks are going to be impacted by violence in some capacity, right? And we're prepared for that by understanding that information and coming into the space with strategies to support and hold that in the space, while also trying to prevent any more from happening. And then we have our more reactive pieces, right? Where our response and our recovery kind of play together, but our response is really that immediate intervention, right? And we see how that works well and how that does not work well. Who benefits and who does not. We're seeing that right now in Maui. We saw it in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is still recovering. But we see who gets the resources and why, right? And much of that has to do with our power and privilege in those spaces, our access, who is deemed human enough. And so we have to really think about our preparedness also incorporating anti-oppression, right? Because if we're not thinking about that, we are not ready to respond and we won't be able to recover in those same ways. So the disaster management framework is not so much to scare us to think like all of this is a disaster and we can't do anything about it, but rather as a tool to expand how we think about our prevention work in general. So I want to stop there before we dive any deeper into this. What questions are coming up or any kind of like thoughts? Because I know this is like a leap or maybe not something people have thought about as a tool.
Can you give some examples of preparedness?
Yes, great question. So we're actually going to dive into that next, which is really about us building strategies, right? Before we even head into our learning spaces. And if we're already there, it's about coming back and not only doing individual self-reflection on like what are our strategies to respond to these things, but also at an organizational level and our community level, how are we engaging? And so some examples of that, at least from Ohio, has been that some of our programs have done community listening circles in order to better understand what is a top priority. I know that one participant had shared like not meeting basic needs before coming in and educating. Like if folks aren't fed, if they're not housed, if they're not if they're not engaged, if we're not creating access in those spaces, transportation, childcare, like we cannot teach because it's really coming from kind of an oppressive perspective, right? It's like, let me come in and save you all from violence. But really it's like, well, part of the violence are the conditions we're living under. And so it's about like those listening circles, some other strategies that local programs have come up with. Our state is so imaginative and creative, and I just like can't say enough about how resilient, and I say that with an understanding that resiliency is like forced in a lot of ways when we're doing this work, and it can lead to burnout. So we're really cognizant of that balance. But there are programs who've created entire pre-programming strategies to engage with caring adults in the learners' lives, where they hold sessions and share kind of the overview of the curricula. Some folks are engaging in like Q&A beforehand, or they've even recorded kind of like an introduction of the facilitator, so that like caring adults are like, this random stranger is coming into this classroom and trying to teach my kid about sex, right? Like that's automatically where it goes, and rightfully so, right? Because we can't separate sex and sexuality and sexual health education from our sexual violence prevention work. And there is something about, we have to recognize that our values are not always going to be everyone else's values. So how are we building some of those bridges to understanding of like, I'm coming in as the educator, I'm not coming in to dictate values. Though we are coming in with a value set, right? No one deserves to experience violence is a value. And so we have to also hold those pieces as well. But those are some of kind of the examples, and we'll dive a little bit deeper. And I am sure there are a bunch of strategies that folks have in this space as well. Thank you for asking. Did you?
I don't know if it's relevant anymore. No? Go for it. Yeah, I was going to say using this kind of model for schools that have a lot of time constraints. So in my experience, that's been one of the barriers. We have an hour to talk about consent, and that's all they'll get for this year. And so you don't get to have as many nuanced conversations. But I think ways to, I guess, create more of a priority for those conversations is to kind of look at it that way, especially in Louisiana, where we talk about disaster recovery all the time, maybe using it through that kind of terminology to kind of help.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think those are some of the things, right? Time constraint is such a huge part of it, right? And when we respect the time of our partners, we're showing that we're invested in the work that they're doing. And then we're building some of those less transactional and more relational relationships. And that's a strategy to getting more folks on board. If we are building that relationship where we're like, we respect that time and this is what we can offer, then we may have more positive interactions with the teachers in the space and the administration, and over time might be able to expand the amount of time we are able to be in those spaces. So thank you for sharing that. All right. Couple of things. These are also moved into the infographic that I showed you at the beginning. These are just some ideas to kind of start our brains going. These might not apply to everyone, but there's some things to think about. Is from an organizational standpoint, these are some things we need to consider is like, how are we creating equitable relationships, community partnerships that are what we would call love with accountability, right? We're not engaging in partnerships that are continuing to harm and surveil and stop us from doing the work. We have to find where that boundary is. If that means that we're changing language in the curriculum from consent to permission, that might be a boundary you're okay with. But if it says removing any queer or trans inclusion in the curriculum, it's like, is that an organizational value? And that's where those conversations really have to come into play before we're sending preventionists who may have the least amount of power to make that decision, especially in a charged environment, to be grounded in who can I go to who said, like, this is, say, the MOU. We created a boundary around this, and this is what we're sticking to because we agreed to this as a group. And if we need to revisit that, then who is having that conversation? Because putting that on a preventionist, a prevention educator in the space to navigate is just another thing that's ramping up the potential for turnover and a failure to retain knowledge and skills in our field. Because like, how many people are not getting paid enough to do the work they do? And what if we add on layers to that, right? Of getting harassed, quite frankly, harassed in classrooms by parents, by teachers, by community members. How much does that add to the layers of decisions to leave the field? Some other things to just keep in mind is like exemption slips. That might be a boundary. That might be a boundary for your organization that we're not offering opt-out slips. But is that really consensual education? So it's again also reflecting on some of the oppressive practices we might be engaging with, even though we're prioritizing sexual violence education and saying like prevention is so important and we have to prioritize it in order to create safer communities. But if we're doing that with folks who are not ready to have those conversations and we're forcing them into the education, how much are we modeling what we're claiming to teach? Right? And so it's some of these reflections that we have to have with ourselves and our organizations. A couple of other things, some things that we can do from a preventionist standpoint, especially for our supervisors in the room, for our leadership in the room. It's incredibly important that we're tapping into the whole person experience of our staff, and not just saying that it's a whole person experience for our community members and not just being culturally responsive externally, but rather also extending that to our staff as well. So some of that can look like we already have the tools to safety plan, right? Like we already understand the facets of safety planning. Again, with like the disaster management framework, this is also another framework we already have that we can use before we're heading into classrooms. What does a safety plan look like for a prevention educator? I'll say when I was teaching sex ed in the school systems, just as like an example, is I went into a school in which there were 2 teachers who did not share the values that comprehensive sex ed should be taught. And I was cornered in a classroom after the first day of class by these teachers and berated. They did not help me in the classroom to facilitate. I had many students with varying learning needs. I had disabled students. I had students who couldn't read, and they refused to help to facilitate. And that was part of our contract, but I didn't know that because I was not given that information ahead of time. So what does it look like to sit down with our teams and not only talk through what the MOU already says, but rather build the MOU with our teams, right? Because in that moment, I didn't know what to do. I did not have the tools. I didn't know that I could say, per our contract, this is what it says, right? But had I had that, it could have been an easy way for me to disengage from the conversation and continue on. But unfortunately, what happened instead was that it was shown as a conflict and that we had to stop teaching in that classroom. I was teaching in the rest of the school, but couldn't teach this class. And it harmed the very class that also they pushed all disabled students into. So what are we, again, when we think about disaster management frameworks, it's also about who is the most impacted by us not proactively planning, right? So something to keep in mind. Again, these will be shared with you to kind of take back and explore individually and with your organizations. Again, Monica and I came up with some guiding questions that are part of the roadmap that are really helpful as conversation starters, because these can be hard conversations to have internally, because we have to reflect on our own complicity in some of the ways that these barriers are cropping up. It's all well and good that we teach boundary setting, but we also teach boundary setting in the context of power and oppression. And so boundary setting can absolutely be an individual tool, but if we do not have the support of our organization to set those boundaries, then we can't set them without putting our jobs in precarity, right? And so again, it's about thinking that these strategies are not just either or, they're often both, right? They're both and, because we can say that this is a boundary I'm not willing to push past. But if our supervisors or our leadership at the organization say, that's just not a boundary we can hold. That's when we really have to think about like, what are we doing, both individually and organizationally, right? Because if we're willing to internally perpetuate violence at an organization, then we can't necessarily model what we're doing externally, right? So something to keep in mind as we're developing these strategies, that it's not just gonna be like, we applied it, we're done, we did the thing, we're great. It's gonna be a constant kind of updating and revision. So I asked this last question mostly for folks to think about how did collaborating in those strategy building, whether that was even a solo journal because you're thinking about the things that we're applying today, or in your conversations, how did collaboration help you build strategies? Were there things you didn't think about before or you got clearer on because you were engaging in collaboration? Because it's so important that when we are sitting in our silos, it's building up those coalitions, as was stated, right? And also showing up in our communities to talk about those strategies. So as we close out, we'll do a bit of kind of debriefing on things. One of the things I want to share with you just briefly is this is part of the roadmap. One of our strategies, both organizationally and individually, is also proactively getting clear about what we are and are not teaching in our curricula, getting clear about what our values are, about what do we mean by anti-oppression, right? Like, does it mean simply that we are applying, say, a scenario that includes Black students in the scenario, or it includes a queer person in the scenario? Or does it mean that we are actually working from and with our community members to build out those pieces? And so we actually have to get clear about those things organizationally before we can actually articulate it to our community partners. So this is a very, what we would say, easy strategy because it's already in front of us, but it's actually a pretty daunting strategy because it takes time and prioritization. That means that organizations have to be prioritizing prevention in order to do that. So just a reminder that you do have all the tools. We literally heard it bustling throughout the space today. So just remember that it's important for us to really check in our toolboxes as we are developing strategies, not just continuously saying we have to pivot, we have to pivot. It can mean, hey, let's tap back into this thing that I already have or we've already done in the past and revise it a bit. Adaptability is key. We know that. Curricula is such an important piece of that, is like, what are we willing to adapt and what aren't we? But also, what are we doing to adapt to the spaces and our community norms and values while also like meeting people where they are, but not leaving them there, is an important part of the adaptability. And there's a strength in the collective, right? We're here in this space together right now, but that also means that there's a collective strength in your community. I can guarantee that the vast majority of your communities are committed to this idea that they don't want violence to happen, especially for young people. So how do we start there and work together to build? And so developing the plan, as we kind of finish things up in the last few minutes, these are things that you can take back to your organization. They're in the resources available to you all. And it's really thinking about, I would encourage you all, as you're thinking about the barriers that we talked about earlier today, what is really the biggest barrier that you at your organization or in your state or in your program you're facing? I encourage you to really put that at the top of a list and create a list between organization and prevention strategies and start listing off the strategies you can approach. Do this with your teams. Don't do it just by yourself and think that that's gonna be enough, because we really do need each other to build it together. And that means, so had we had a little bit more time, it's really about that, right? Is brainstorming together. We already had that as a strategy, that brainstorming sessions were happening as part of the solutions. I'm really doing that with community partners, because if we're not clear with our community partners, we're not clear in the classroom. prioritizing our strategies that both proactively work within our organization and within our capacity. It's not just about taking on more schools and saying that's a successful strategy. It's about really looking at where is going to be the ripple effect most effective. Does that mean doing a series at, say, your like community center where there are students, where there's learners of all ages in that space? Does that mean offering your curriculum that you're teaching your young learners to adults in a night class? That's one thing that a local program is doing, and it's had varied success, but they're really sticking with it to see, like, how might that open doors not only to being transparent about the curricula, but also how to build skills and knowledge intergenerationally. And then finally, developing your steps to implementation. Same thing with what we do with our project management and anything, right? Is like, see how this works when we're starting to apply these pieces, these solutions or strategies, and revisiting over time, both individually and as teams and organizations of like, has this helped us? Has this helped strengthen our relationships in the schools? Do we have more trust in the community? Remembering that qualitative data is just as important as our quantitative data. So it's not about just taking on more schools and saying, look at how many people we've increased in our reach, but rather, what is the quality of that? And finally, just some next steps. Don't forget about the beginning stages of your implementation plan. Right here, the collaboration of talking with each other about strategies is the start. It's about exploring ideas for integration into your organization's strategic plan. That's a really great thing that you can keep coming back to say, hey, we committed to this thing. It's here right in our plan, and like, we need support. Finally, considering what partners you'll need to build capacity and strategies. So again, that coalition building. And you can even, I would encourage, if you've got cards on you, pass them around in the space. Clearly, most people are facing mounting barriers. So pass along. If we're working across the country, we can work together to end this onslaught of restrictive policies, but really we can prioritize our communities in that effort. And finally, take a breath, because it's a long haul and there are days that it's really hard, but I really appreciate you all continuing to commit to a world without violence, and our imaginations really get us there. So again, mitigation is sustainable prevention. You don't have all the answers, we do together, and response doesn't prevent. So I appreciate you all coming today. Please, if you are interested in connecting, I have cards as well as my contact information up here. Thank you again, everyone. Enjoy NSAC.